All right, y'all. So it's been an exciting evening. So I'm reading from Introduction to Internal Family Systems Model by Richard Schwartz, and now we're on the chapter called The Self. I'm starting a little bit in okay, check this out. The Secret of the Gods. According to an ancient legend, there was a time when the gods were trying to decide where to hide the secret to peace and joy. They didn't want humans to find it until they were ready to appreciate it. One god said, let's hide it on the highest mountain. Another said, no, it would be found there too soon and too easily. Another god suggested hiding it deep in the densest forest, but that location was rejected for the same reason. After many other suggestions and rejections, the wisest god said, hide it in the human heart. That's the last place they'll look. The gods all agreed, so that's where they put it. The gods were very wise. The last place we look for peace and joy is inside ourselves. We search everywhere else, in intimate relationships, careers, purchases, travel, gurus, self-help groups, and in the grace of God above. Yet over the centuries in different parts of the world, small groups of people have looked inside and found the secret that the gods hid. They're known as the esoteric, or instead, it comes from the Greek esotero, which means further in. Esoteric traditions are those that have looked further inside people, in contrast to conventional esoteric religions. Though they use different words, all these groups say the same thing. We are sparks of the eternal flame, drops of the divine ocean, manifestations of the absolute ground of being. But because we don't look inside, we have little awareness of who we really are. If we learn to hold awareness of who we really are, we find peace and joy. As I explored the writings of some of these esoteric schools, it gradually dawned on me that through interacting with people's parts in ways that allowed the individuals to separate from their emotions and beliefs, I'd accidentally come upon a simple way to help people access the state of consciousness that those traditions sought through meditation and other techniques. I had stumbled upon the secret of the gods. Who's there when you step back? Actually, the process of focusing on a part of you and asking it to step back is similar to forms of meditation in which people separate from and witness their thoughts. For example, a popular form of Buddhist meditation called Vipassana involves simply witnessing each thought or emotional state that arises. The more you notice or step back from, rather than become or identify with your thoughts and emotions, the more you relax into being the you who is not your thoughts and emotions. Many traditions speak of this as being a state of emptiness, of no self. What they often mean is no ego or conditioned mind, and what I call no parts. Knowledge of the special place within us is not limited to Eastern traditions. Thomas Merton, one of the most significant Christian scholars and writers of the 20th century, wrote, if we enter into ourselves, finding our true self, and then passing beyond the inner eye, we sail forth into the immense darkness in which we confront the I am of the Almighty. Our innermost I exists in God, and God swells in it. Hence, the Christian mystical experience is not only an awareness of the inner self, but also it is an experiential grasp of God as present within our inner self. Merton developed a meditative practice called centering prayer that's become widespread among Christians in the West, due in a large part to the efforts of Father Thomas Keating, who agrees that God and our true self are not separate. The Quakers call it the inner light, the Buddhists call it Rigpa, or Buddha nature, Hindus call it Atman, or the self, Miser Eckhart called it the God seed. For Sufis, it's the beloved, the God within. Whether you believe it is God inside you or simply a higher level of consciousness, there's consensus among traditions around the world that such a place exists within us and that it is not difficult to tap into. The words used by different traditions to describe the self state, inherent wisdom and compassion, a sense of freedom, lightness, release, stability, lucidity, are some of the qualities my clients report and display when their parts step back and their self is released. People have known for centuries about this peaceful state that I'm calling self. The more I explored the spiritual territory, the more I felt the way Ralph Waldo Emerson did when he said, "All my best ideas were stolen by the ancients." But that state's not the exclusive domain of spiritual explorers. Other non-spiritual practitioners have also recognized the benefits derived from turning down the mind's noise. For example, Betty Edwards, author of Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain, found that people can draw much better than they believed possible when in that state. Tim Galway, who wrote The Inner Game of Tennis, sparked a wide variety of books that describe how much better athletes perform when in this state. The developer of biofeedback, Elmer Green, found that when people achieved the theta brainwave state, a place of deep relaxation full of imagery, they could produce remarkable control over physiological processes that were considered uncontrollable. That discovery led Eugene Peniston to train chronic alcoholics to achieve theta. The finding that they quit drinking opened the field of biofeedback training to treat a wide range of disorders. This state has been called flow by researcher. Oh, I never can pronounce this dude's name. I'm not even going to try. It's really long, lots of syllables. Who found that it characterized the experience of all kinds of creative and high-performing people. Thus, it seems clear that this mindful state of self is not just a peaceful place from which to witness the world, nor just a state to which one can go to transcend the world. The self also has healing, creative, and performance-enhancing qualities. When my clients entered this self state, they didn't just passively witness their parts, they began to actively interact with them in creative and healing ways. All right, so check it out. This is the part that I read to myself when I'm trying to get myself back on track. Okay, so this is called the self-led person. Okay, you know what? I'm gonna keep going. I'm gonna read the qualities of the self. Let's continue to examine the qualities of the self. As we've discussed, there's agreement among the world's esoteric traditions that such a state exists in us. In most of those traditions, however, messages suggest that language is inadequate to capture this concept of self. That may be so, but because different people describe similar experiences and display similar qualities when in that state, we can describe aspects of those experiences and qualities. To clarify this discussion, I find it useful to differentiate between what people report while meditating, while being reabsorbed into the ocean, and what people are like when their self is actively leading their everyday life, while being a separate wave of the ocean. It's that oceanic state which seems so difficult to describe. People report feeling as if they have no boundaries, are one with the universe, and lose their identity as a separate being. This is accompanied by a sense of spaciousness in the body that can provide an experience of great contentment as well as moments of bliss. People often feel a pulsating energy or warmth running through their body and may sense light in or around them. As they deepen their meditative practice, people encounter different levels and stages with which the different esoteric traditions have explored and charted. Ken Wilber's work provides a good summary of those ascending stages of consciousness. My purpose here is less to acquaint you with those ethereal realms than to help you bring some of that awareness, spaciousness, and energy to your daily tasks and relationships. What qualities do people report and display when they live in the world while holding the memory of who they really are? What are the characteristics of self-leadership? I don't know the full answer to that question, and after 20 years of helping people move towards greater self-leadership, I describe what my clients exhibit as they increasingly embody self. As I sifted through various adjectives to capture my observations, I repeatedly came up with words that began with the letter C. So now we're going to travel the 8 C's of self-leadership. Calmness. A pervasive sense of physiological and mental calm accompanies self-leadership. Many people, especially those who've experienced traumas, feel constant tension in their body, as if they contain a tightly wound spring, which makes them hypervigilant and agitated. If you're like them, this state of physical arousal makes you overreact to other people and prevents you from ever truly relaxing. Your mind reflects this aroused state with thoughts and urges jumping around, to use the Buddhist metaphor, like a hyperactive or drunken monkey. As you embody yourself, you will be relieved to find far less activity in your body and mind. As a result, you'll react to triggers in your environment in less automatic and extreme ways. The monkeys in your mind become mellow, basking in the reduction in worries and responsibilities that come with trusting yourself to handle the world. In the face of anger, you aren't overwhelmed by the common fight, flight, or freeze impulses, and instead maintain an inner equanimity. Many people appear to be calm on the outside, but internally are a frenzy of activity. Many of us have been trained to hide our distress behind a calm, thoughtful exterior, but that's being frozen, not calm. This is not to say that self-led people walk around in a Buddha-like state of serene detachment. They ride on the roller coaster of life like everybody else. It's just that, for them, the ride that used to produce a white-knuckled clinging more often becomes interesting and sometimes painful or joyful. Where they used to be totally absorbed by each emotion or totally cut off from each one, they now experience the waves of feeling, but also hold a calm center that's never totally washed away. The center of the cyclone, what I call the eye of the storm. So that was calmness, and the next one's clarity. Clarity. I define clarity as the ability to perceive situations without distortion from extreme beliefs and emotions. In other words, seeing through the eyes of the self. As someone who's worked extensively with eating disordered clients, I've seen how powerful parts of us can affect our perceptions. When a rail-thin anorexic client looks in the mirror, she literally sees a fat person. But that's only an extreme example of the kind of distorting we do all the time. For example, recall a time when you were infatuated with someone. Perhaps you became oblivious to conspicuous red flags. Then, when that same person did something hurtful, it's likely that all you could see were the person's flaws, and you wondered what you used to like about him or her. A traditional story illustrates this point well. A man whose axe was missing suspected his neighbor's son. The boy walked like a thief, looked like a thief, and spoke like a thief. Soon the man found his axe while he was digging in the valley. And the next time he saw his neighbor's son, the boy walked, looked, and spoke just like any other child. In other words, we rarely take a fresh, open look at a person or situation because we so quickly and automatically jump to conclusions based on previous experience and current desire. As the expression goes, to a man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. I had a client, Bill, for example, who was desperate to get married. A part of him immediately rated every woman he met as a potential mate or not. In addition, Bill felt like he had been rejected by his mother at an early age, so a protective part sized up every potential mate as like, mom, that is dangerous, or not. To complicate things, Bill had always hoped to be accepted by his mother, so another part of him wanted the potential mate to be like his mom and wouldn't let him feel attracted to women who were not. Every woman he met unwittingly stepped into his radar system with all of its conflicting categories, and her qualities were distorted or ignored accordingly. The women he dated complained about getting many mixed messages and stated he didn't really know them. They were right. For Bill to really know any of these women, he would need to get all these parts and their projections to step back and let his self experience the women. When that's possible, we have what the Buddhists call beginner's mind, a perspective in which many possibilities exist because of the absence of preconception and projection. In contrast, the expert's mind is overflowing with beliefs that limit perception and possibility. Our parts often think they are experts on the world. The self always has a beginner's mind. Curiosity. In addition to containing many possibilities, the beginner's mind is also full of wonder about the world. If we don't prejudge things, we're perpetually curious. Like an inquisitive child, we're full of innocent interest in people and their reactions. If people are angry at us and our view of them isn't clouded by feelings connected with others who have been angry at us in the past, we become curious about their anger. When we ask them about it, they'll sense no fear or judgment in our question, just innocent interest. This kind of curiosity is at the heart of the IFS approach. It's how the self relates not only to people, but also to inner voices. When we're able to become non-judgmentally interested in even our most despised inner demons, such as contempt, or racism, or self-hate, we find those internal dialogues to be enlightening and transformative. The Buddhists call this kind of non-striving, open curiosity towards our inner thoughts and emotions mindfulness. Many of their practices are designed to help people become more mindful. That kind of pure, guileless curiosity is disarming. People and parts of us sense that they no longer must protect themselves because they see that we intend only to try to understand them. Since all they usually want is to be understood, they have no reason to remain angry or defensive. Instead, they're often glad to tell their story and feel heard by a person who's not trying to change them. In this book, this is what's meant by the term witnessing, asking about and listening to a person or part with genuine curiosity and with the intent to achieve the next quality, compassion. Compassion. When your view of people is not distorted by the parts of you that fear or need them, you're not as affected by the ways they protect themselves. Then your curiosity can lead you to see behind their anger or distancing and learn about the hurt they're protecting. To clarify what's meant by compassion, I want to contrast it to pity and to empathy. With pity, you see someone suffering and you feel sorry for him or her, but at the same time, a part of you is glad that the person isn't you. Your mind is busy thinking of reasons you wouldn't make the mistakes he or she made that led to the suffering. Pity involves both a protective distancing and a measure of condescension. Condescension. Your sorrow for the sufferer comes from a place of separateness. When you feel empathy, you see a person suffering, and because you have a certain level of self-awareness, you know a part of you suffers in the same way, so you identify with the sufferer's pain. At some level, that person's the same as you. Empathy opens your heart and produces a strong desire to help the person. The danger with empathy, however, is that if you identify too much, you'll feel a pressure to relieve the other's misery. You can't tolerate your own pain, so you can't stand for the other to spend. When you feel compassion, you see a person suffering, you feel empathy for him or her, and you know that the other has a self, which, once released, can relieve his or her own misery. If people relieve their own suffering, they learn to trust their own self, and they learn whatever lessons the suffering has to teach them. Compassion, then, leads to doing whatever possible to foster the release of the other's self, rather than become the other's healer. With compassion, you can be open-heartedly present with sufferers without feeling the urge to change them or distance them. This kind of self-presence will often release their own self. There are, of course, situations in which the other self can't be released while he or she is overwhelmed by physical pain or illness. In those settings, the compassionate thing to do is to treat those conditions first, while also holding the intention that relief leads to more self-leadership. Also, as you become increasingly self-led, increasingly aware of the ocean and not just the waves, the sense of separation between you and others is reduced. The desire to help people who suffer, as well as those who create suffering, arises spontaneously with the increased appreciation of our interconnectedness. It arises from an intuitive understanding that the suffering of others affects you because, at some level, the other is you. For most people, this isn't a conscious thought. They just feel drawn to do something more meaningful with their lives. Confidence. One reason self-led people can remain calm and clear in the face of anger is because they trust that no matter what the offended person claims happened, it doesn't mean they're bad or are going to be permanently harmed. We're defensive not because someone is attacking us, but rather because the attack is likely to provoke our inner critics, which in turn trigger the worthlessness and terror we accumulated as children. Whatever slight we receive in the present triggers an echo chamber inside of us of all the similar hurts we've accumulated in the past. Contemporary events are not what we fear. It's the unending reverberations we'll have to endure that scare us. We dread any incident that confirms our worst fears about ourselves. As people heal their vulnerable parts, their critics relax and their defenses drop. They feel self-confident in the sense that their self has healed those parts and has shown its ability to protect them or to comfort them if they're hurt again. When that's the case, you become less susceptible to former provocations because those things no longer set off your inner echo chambers of past hurts. Instead, you react to the present situation, which may indeed involve danger or pain, with the confidence that you can handle or repair whatever happens. Without overreaction, you take steps to protect yourself, and if the interactions are hurtful, afterwards you nurture any parts of you that were hurt. This is the opposite of our socialized tendency to lock up those hurt parts in our effort to let it go, don't look back, and just move on. As a result of that philosophy, not only do we accumulate increasing burdens of pain, but we also abandon and isolate the hurting childlike parts of us instead of nurturing them. This strategy leads to less and less confidence in the self, more vulnerability to the slings and arrows all around us, and consequently, more protective in reference to the self. The knowledge that we're part of the ocean and not just isolated waves brings with it what might be called a sense of grace. Grace is hard to define, and in Christianity has traditionally been seen as a gift or blessing from God. In this book, it's associated with the trust that, as one client put it, I am loved and I am loved, no matter how bad things seem. It's all okay. We'll work out the way it should. With this kind of confidence in the essential goodness of life comes an openness to the beauty of the world and a desire to experience that beauty in each moment. It's hard to stay in the present long enough to experience beauty if you lack this kind of confidence, because you'll be consumed with future plans for survival or gratification. Courage. Clarence Darrow once said, "The most human thing we can do is comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable." The self has the courage to do both. One might think that the self's "it's all okay" sense of grace would lead to a detached passivity and acceptance of the injustices of life, but that's not the nature of the self. The clarity of the self makes it hard for people to deny injustice and ignore suffering. The compassion of the self leads people to resist tyranny and fight for the oppressed. The words of the self bring hope to the hopeless. The energy of the self seeps into the cracks in the tyrant's wall and gradually erodes them. Consequently, oppressors attack people whenever they show any signs of self-leadership. Abusers know that this is the way to control people, which is why virtually all my clients who have been severely sexually abused report that any time they acted in a spirited, spontaneous, or independent way, they were either verbally or physically punished. As a result, they came to fear the self and keep it out of their body. Thus, rather than making people passive, confidence and grace have the opposite effect. If we don't fear attack because we aren't as vulnerable, and if we trust that we can handle the consequences, courage is much more acceptable to us. If we know that everyone is a wave in the same ocean, we'll challenge injustice without judgment. While so far we've emphasized the compassionate, nurturing side of the self, it's important to remember that the energy of the self can also be forceful and protective. The martial arts cultivate this protective side of the self. We can be forceful without judgment because we know that no matter how an oppressor behaves, he or she has a self, and our goal is to elicit it, not to further burden him or her with our judgment. As Martin Luther King Jr. expressed it, we must realize that the evil deed of the enemy neighbor, the thing that hurts, never quite expresses all that he is. An element of goodness may be found even in our worst enemy. Elsewhere he wrote, "Nonviolence does not seek to defeat or humiliate the opponent, but to win his friendship and understanding. It avoids not only external physical violence, but also internal violence of spirit." The nonviolent resistor not only refuses to shoot his opponent, but he also refuses to hate him. At the center of nonviolence stands the principle of love. If I respond to hate with a reciprocal hate, I do nothing but intensify the cleavage in a broken community. I can only close the gap in a broken community by meeting hate with love. Alright, I'm not in there for the night, it's just late.